A void is opening between Bush and his commanders. The president talks about staying the course, denying terrorists an opportunity to claim an historic victory. But in the trenches, and against all the negative implications, his officers are doing the math, trying to get a fix on what pale imitation of Iraqi democracy might allow them to start bringing home some of the troops ahead of next year's midterm elections. But this is going to be a long, hard-fought insurgency. Rumsfeld stripped away all the layers of the security onion shortly after the invasion of Iraq, when he asked an essential question about progress in the war on terror. Are we capturing, killing, deterring and dissuading more terrorists every day than the madrasas and radical clerics are recruiting, training and deploying against us? He asked. The answer is no. Attacks on the US and Iraq have averaged about 65 a day for the last year, but the weapons and the tactics are becoming more sophisticated. One of Rumsfeld's senior intelligence officers told the New York Times in July, "We're capturing or killing a lot of insurgents, but they're being replaced quicker than we can bust their operations. There's always another insurgent ready to step up and take charge." Rumsfeld himself also seemed to cut through a lot of the "we'll smoke 'em out" nonsense when he predicted in June that the Iraqi insurgency might well last another 12 years. How do you measure progress in Iraq? Under growing pressure and desperate for a new angle, Bush last week claimed that 10 major terrorist strikes had been thwarted since 9/11. But even apart from the headline attacks on Bali, Madrid, London, Sharm el-Sheikh, the US State Department records 651 of what it calls significant terrorist attacks around the world last year. It was the highest figure in 20 years, up 300% on the previous year globally, and in Iraq alone, up 900% on the previous year. Comparisons with World War II, with Vietnam, rankle with the Bush administration. But think about this. 48 months after Pearl Harbor, the US had built an army that defeated Japan and Germany. And after just 2.5 years of the Iraq War, US opinion polls already are registering the same levels of doubt and anxiety that were being recorded in year 7 of the Vietnam conflict. More Americans died in the year after the US returned sovereignty to Iraqis than in the year preceding the handover. And a majority now believes that the Iraq war simply is not worth it. In the last year, the number of poll respondents claiming that people they know are becoming less involved emotionally in the news from Iraq almost doubled to 44%. But Iraq and the war on terror are best measured in their own right by glaring mistakes, appalling ignorance, bad judgment, and if you'll excuse the use of a technical term, stupidity. A searing assessment of the US effort to date by American defense analyst Andrew Krepnevich finds lots of goals, lots of lofty ambitions, but little strategy. His own conclusion in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs is that nearly 2/3 of Americans think the coalition is simply bogged down. The insurgency was able to take advantage of the security vacuum created by the US to establish itself after the demise of Saddam. And the Americans' hunt and kill tactic is not working against the insurgency. Pockets of the country are secure for only as long as US forces are stationed in them. Now, a seeming urge by some in the US to quit Iraq is buoying insurgency hopes of success at the same time as it stokes a local power struggle. This is why all sides in Iraq refuse to stand down their considerable private militias. And the presence of so many Americans and a teetering government that can be presented as an agent of American designs in the region makes it a logical theatre of war for jihadists, whose numbers still are estimated to be perhaps 20,000 Iraqis and no more than a few hundred foreigners. Kretnovich says, the insurgents know they cannot defeat the US-led coalition militarily. Their best chance of success is to wait for a premature US withdrawal and then spark a coup in which a small, well-disciplined group with foreign backing seizes power from a weak and demoralized regime. This is why they fight to perpetuate disorder and to prevent the establishment of a legitimate, democratic Iraqi government. By creating an atmosphere of intimidation, insecurity, and despair, they hope to undermine support for the government. This analysis explains the hypercharged level of the insurgency's violence in Iraq. Sporadic attacks were enough to keep the likes of the Northern Irish insurgency ticking over, but in Iraq the insurgents are so desperate to maintain what essentially remains a post-Saddam vacuum, rather than have a new government find its feet, that they blast away all day, every day. They believe the US-led coalition lacks staying power. They see proof for this in the Americans' withdrawals from Beirut in the 80s and Somalia in the 90s, and in that flood of US opinion polls that showed deepening disquiet with the manner in which George Bush went to war and the conduct of his war. In Iraq, the warring sides wrestle for control of three vital hearts and minds centers of gravity: the Iraqi people, the American people, and the US military. To win this war, the US has to capture and hold all three. The insurgents need only one for victory. Kretnovich concludes, the key is to recognize that US forces have overwhelming advantage in terms of combat power and mobility, but a key disadvantage in terms of their intelligence gathering. If they knew who the insurgents were and where they were, they could quickly suppress the insurgency. The Iraqi people are the best sources of that information. But the US and their allies can only get that knowledge if they win local hearts and minds. That is, they've got to convince the locals that the defeat of the insurgents is in their interests. This is a very tantalizing issue because it goes to where the Iraqi people, it's a root test, if you like, of what the Iraqi people really think of what's happening around them. Is a $25 million price on bin Laden's head not enough to seduce just one person into dobbing him in? Think of how many it takes to maintain his secrecy at the moment. The same applies to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in Iraq, and all the families and all the friends of the thousands of individuals who make up the insurgency. Why, in a population of millions, are so few prepared to spill the beans to US or Iraqi intelligence? Undoubtedly, there's a fear element, but there's another overpowering reason. They don't trust Americans, especially the Shia. The Shia are the majority, but they in particular don't trust the Americans. They were betrayed by Washington when they rose against Saddam 14 years ago. And the Arab regimes that the US has supported for more than half a century are all Sunni who rule over sizable Shia minorities. Brooding on the Iraqi sidelines are the Iranian Shia, who are despised in Washington. But during the Saddam years, the Iranians looked after the Shiites of Iraq, funding and training their militias, and sheltering those who fled into exile. Now the Iranians are reaping a huge dividend, as a procession of Iraq's new Shiite leaders beats a path to their door. In Washington, there's a joke that doesn't get too many laughs. The Iraq War is over, and the Iranians won. The debate among analysts is not so much when will the Iraq civil war start, as much as has it started. I've always been of the view that with 20% plus of the world's oil, Iraqis are destined to have a great and prosperous future. Sadly, I don't see it eventuating this side of a full-blown civil war. Even Henry Kissinger, that old Republican warlord himself, has taken to lecturing the White House on the danger of cutting US troop numbers too soon, because he's anxious that Washington's creation of a new Iraqi military is actually a prelude to inevitable civil war. As the former Secretary of State sees it, the new Iraqi security forces are essentially Shiite, and the insurgency is mostly in areas that traditionally are Sunni. That's a return to the traditional Sunni-Shiite conflict, he says. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi is Osama bin Laden's pointsman in Iraq. He is determined to bring a civil war on as he scratches at the Sunni-Shiite fault line with his constant and brutal suicide bombings in Shiite communities. And despite the pretense of not responding violently, the Shiites are now hitting back. Their private armies have taken control of entire sections of the military, police, and intelligence services. They run their own illegal prisons. I've seen them. I've been driven past them. And now they're rounding up Sunnis for summary execution. Last weekend, I spoke by phone to an associate of one of Iraq's new breed of Shiite henchmen. He reported that his acquaintance, who I've met, had executed 37 Sunnis in the previous 24 hours, and how that night they were to be guests at one of the highest Shiite tables in the land for iftar, the twilight breaking of the Ramadan feast. Sunni hitmen also stalk Shiites living in Sunni strongholds, paying locals to identify their targets, and both Shiite and Sunni families are now reportedly selling up and moving out of areas in which they are in localized minorities. Even in the supposed peace of the British-controlled South, rival Shiite gangs and militias are carving out territory. The local police chief admits he can trust only a quarter of his men, and diplomats admit that the British grip on security is tenuous. It's a cruel merry-go-round. 25 years ago, the Americans always took great pleasure in giving Moscow its very own Vietnam War in Afghanistan. But check the blowback now. What the US-funded war against the 1980s Soviet occupation of Afghanistan actually did was to convince the Afghan Mujahideen and the thousands of Arabs who fought with them, including bin Laden and Zarqawi, that they could defeat a superpower. Call them mad, but they now believe they can do it again. This time they have Washington in their sights, not Moscow. And just as Bush tots up successes, so too does bin Laden. On 9/11, al-Qaeda savagely dented America's superpower prestige. In Iraq, Zarqawi is now mauling the US and the new Iraqi government. And wherever they strike around the globe, terrorists put a question mark over what has been long-standing support for the US, which, through much of the Middle East, now is at rock bottom. Remember Bush's use of the word crusade? He'd have us believe that he's cleaning up terrorists in Iraq. But this is a fight that the Islamic terrorists relish. Apart from spot attacks around the globe, which have a limited shelf life because of the shrinking news attention span of so many of the Western world these days,